The motion before us. Football is not the world's most popular sport. It is the world's most politically consequential cultural phenomenon. At the table tonight, three minds approaching this claim from different directions. The empiricist, who tests grand claims against what can actually be measured, and finds that the gap between what we believe institutions do and what the evidence shows they do is often where the interesting argument lives. The geographer, who thinks through places and the specific humans who inhabit them, who knows that political consequence is not an abstraction, but something that happens to particular people in particular streets in particular years. And the essayist, who watches for the patterns in how millions of people actually behave and asks what those patterns reveal about the architecture of meaning in a society. What is at stake is not whether football matters. It plainly does. The question is whether it matters in the way the motion claims. Whether a game becomes a structure through which power moves, identity forms, and conflicts either resolve or intensify. Whether we are describing genuine political consequence or merely mistaking visibility for influence, passion for power. We are speaking in 2026. The nation-state system that gave football much of its political charge is under different pressures than it was in 1914 or 1969. The institutions that once monopolized identity construction face competition they have never faced before. And yet, 3 billion people will watch the next World Cup. The question is what kind of watching that is, and what it does. Empiricist, you have the floor.
The epistemological question here is whether we are observing genuine causation or merely coincidence with good narrative texture. Football's temporal correlation with political events is striking. The causal claim is much harder. Start here. What would we need to see to establish that a cultural practice has political consequence rather than political decoration? We would need evidence that its removal or presence changes political outcomes. That elites treat it as strategic infrastructure, not entertainment. That it generates loyalties strong enough to override other identity categories when they conflict. And that these effects persist across radically different political systems, democracies, autocracies, colonial administrations, revolutionary states. Take the evidence in order. The Christmas truce of 1914 was real. British and German soldiers played football in no man's land on December 25th. But it stopped nothing. The war continued for 4 more years and killed 17 million people. What the truce reveals is not football's capacity to prevent violence, but its capacity to provide a script for fraternization when soldiers had already decided not to fight. The cause precedes the game, not the reverse. The 1969 Honduras-El Salvador War, the so-called Soccer War, followed 3 World Cup qualifying matches. But those matches occurred in a context of land pressure. El Salvador had something like 20 times the population density of Honduras, and hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans had migrated to Honduran agricultural land in the previous decade. Honduras passed agrarian reform targeting those migrants in April 1969. The football matches happened in June. The war started in July. Put it this way, if the matches had been canceled, would the war have been averted? The land conflict would remain. The nationalist rhetoric would find another trigger. Football provided a convenient intensifier, but the structural conditions were load-bearing. Remove the game, and you still have the war. Remove the land pressure, and the game remains a game. Now take the counterfactual seriously. Can you name a single political conflict that football prevented? Not postponed, prevented. Not symbolically resolved, actually resolved. The question is not whether football reflects political tensions, which it obviously does. The question is whether it alters their trajectory. What we observe is correlation dressed in the language of causation. What we do not observe is football changing the course of events that were not already in motion. That distinction is where the entire motion stands or falls.
The empiricist is looking for football's signature on the instruments of surrender and declarations of war. It is a reasonable place to look, and he is right not to find it there. The mistake is in assuming that the most consequential political acts are still conducted solely between foreign ministries. The deeper political consequence lies not in altering the trajectory of states, but in providing an alternative to them when they fail. Consider the geography of urban divergence in late 20th century France. Between 1975 and 1990, the city of Saint-Étienne lost nearly a third of its industrial workforce as the coal mines and steel foundries that had defined it for a century were systematically closed under a program of managed rationalization. The central government's strategy was one of structural adjustment applied from Paris, with little consultation and considerable indifference. The state, as an institution of economic hope, had effectively withdrawn. Now consider a young man of the Gir Valley, raised in a terraced street in the shadow of a closed pithead, watching the city empty of its purpose. His physical world is one of derelict plant and shuttered cooperative halls. The state offers him retraining schemes and a narrative that his region is a legacy problem awaiting resolution. And yet, across the previous decade, AS Saint-Étienne had been the dominant force in French football. 10 league titles, a European Cup final, representing a working-class industrial city on the continent's grandest stages, not with apology, but with authority. The club is not, in this context, political decoration. It is among the only institutions that had ever spoken the city's name with pride before an international audience. It provides a map of the world in which a coal town is not peripheral, but consequential. It offers a story of collective identity considerably more sustaining than the one the technocrats in Paris are constructing. This is not a trivial matter of escapism. When a primary source of social cohesion, collective identity, and international representation is a private sporting entity, not a public institution, the political order has fundamentally changed. We see this pattern not merely in France, but in the post-industrial cities of South Yorkshire, Sheffield, where two football clubs between them hold the self-understanding of a city that the Thatcher settlement largely abandoned, or in Marseille, where Olympique's victories have historically operated as a rebuke to a Parisian establishment perceived as both geographically remote and culturally contemptuous. The empiricist is searching for football's power to stop a war. He overlooks its power to hold a city together when the state has already surrendered. He has failed to account for what happens when the state recedes, and something else fills the void. That is the real political consequence.
Both the empiricist and the geographer treat the nation-state as the fixed unit whose power football either decorates, intensifies, or replaces. One searches for measurable effects on state decisions. The other observes clubs sustaining identity where the state is withdrawn. Neither examines the possibility that the decisive behavioral shift is away from national football altogether. What millions are doing now is transferring sustained attention and payment from domestic leagues and national teams to a handful of foreign clubs whose matches they can watch every week. In sub-Saharan Africa, Premier League subscriptions have risen sharply, while gate receipts and television audiences for local competitions have fallen. In parts of Southeast Asia, satellite registrations linked to English and Spanish clubs outnumber those for national team broadcasts in major urban areas. These are not neutral consumption choices. They represent the reallocation of the scarce resource that football has always traded on, consistent emotional investment across seasons. The pattern repeats wherever satellite and streaming access expanded after the late 1990s. Domestic leagues lose spectators and revenue. Foreign leagues gain both. The institutions that once carried the primary burden of national self-representation are losing their audience to organizations headquartered elsewhere and owned by distant investors. This is not supplementation, it is substitution at scale. If political consequence is measured by which institutions secure durable loyalty and revenue, then the relevant movement is not between state and club inside a single country. It is the movement of that loyalty across borders, week after week, in numbers large enough to reshape domestic football economies. The nation-state framework both prior speakers assume may already be the secondary arena rather than the primary one. The empiricist states that remove the game and you still have the war. In Argentina, after 1978, when the military junta hosted the World Cup while conducting disappearances at the SMA detention center 3 miles from the tournament's host stadium in Buenos Aires, what observable shift in domestic repression rates or elite coalition stability would count as evidence that the tournament altered the junta's room for maneuver rather than simply decorating it?
The question is well put and catches me making a claim larger than the evidence will bear. The accurate version, we lack systematic data on month-by-month repression rates under the Medici regime fine-grained enough to isolate the tournament's effect from other variables, economic growth in that period, shifts in military faction dominance, external diplomatic pressure. What we observe is the regime broadcasting football success while conducting repression, which demonstrates instrumental use. Not that the tournament itself altered the intensity or duration of that repression. The sharper claim, tournaments provide temporal windows during which regimes can raise the cost of dissent without raising visibility. Media attention flows towards stadiums. Protest becomes harder to organize when the national mood is orchestrated elsewhere. That is not decoration. That is strategic displacement of attention during a bounded period when the regime needs it most. But here is the question the essayist should be asking. If the decisive shift is toward transnational club loyalty, why do World Cup television audiences still dwarf club finals? The 2022 final drew roughly 3 times the viewership of the largest Champions League final estimates. Why does a tournament structured entirely around national teams remain the single largest coordinated human attention event if the nation-state framework has become secondary? The substitution thesis requires explaining what that residual pull actually is. The Geographer claims that when institutions like Liverpool FC hold a city together after the state withdraws, this constitutes genuine political consequence rather than mere decoration. But holding together and governing are not the same act. Here is the test. In Turin, Juventus remained commercially successful and emotionally central through the same decades when the city's primary employer contracted dramatically. If the club were providing the political function the Geographer describes, not symbolic compensation, but actual structural replacement, we should observe measurable differences in social outcomes: crime rates, youth unemployment pathways, local tax compliance, civil society formation. What evidence demonstrates that the club's presence altered those trajectories rather than simply existing alongside them? The question is not whether people felt better. It is whether the presence of a successful football club changed what happened to them.
The empiricist is right. A football club does not function as a department of social services, and I was imprecise to suggest it does. Looking for Juventus to alter Turin's crime statistics is indeed searching for the wrong data signature. The true political power is not in replacing the state, but in bypassing it. Consider the regeneration footprint of Manchester City's Abu Dhabi-backed expansion in East Manchester. This is not a stadium. It is a £500 million private re-engineering of the Beswick and Ancoats corridor, in which the club's property arm, City Football Group's development vehicle, has become the de facto planning authority for several city blocks. For Patricia Nwosu, whose family operated a hardware business on Ashton New Road for over 2 decades, the consequence was not symbolic. Compulsory purchase orders and lease terminations were not initiated by the elected council chamber. They followed the club's master plan timeline. The municipal authority ratified decisions it did not originate. So my question back to the empiricist is this: when a private entity can rewrite the land use map of a city borough, is that not a measurable outcome? The essayist is correct that the most significant flow of allegiance is now across continents. But this is not simply a matter of television subscriptions. In Kinshasa, the satellite signal has created its own physical geography, the Inganda, small viewing rooms which have become primary centers of social life. A man like Jean-Pierre, who runs a Chelsea Inganda in the Matong district, finds himself mediating disputes and arranging security on match days. My question is this: when a London club's brand underwrites a new informal civic order in Congo, has local political life been hollowed out, or has it been franchised?
The Geographer's question isolates the correct variable, not disappearance, but the precise terms on which local authority is reorganized. The honest reading is that governments in several large African markets have shifted regulatory weight toward protecting foreign broadcast revenues. visible in the pattern of spectrum auctions and content quotas that treat European League rights as priority infrastructure. This produces a measurable skew in public spending away from facilities that might support domestic competition. Yet the same data also show that World Cup qualification cycles still trigger short, intense bursts of state-directed investment in national team training and stadium upgrades, precisely because those moments remain the only occasions when domestic institutions can command the same weekly attention now commanded by distant clubs. The substitution therefore remains incomplete but directional.
The question is whether we are witnessing political consequence, or the privatization of consequence itself, the transfer of functions we once thought belonged to states into the hands of entities we still call sports clubs, but which now operate as cross-border attention monopolies with the revenue streams of small nations. We are speaking in 2026. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund owns 4 major clubs across 3 continents. Qatar hosts a World Cup whose infrastructure killed thousands of migrant workers whose deaths were systematically undercounted. China attempted to build geopolitical influence through club acquisitions before capital controls ended the experiment. The United States, Mexico, and Canada will co-host the next tournament in a North America whose political relationship to migration has become the continent's central fracture. So the question for the table: when a cultural institution commands 3 billion people's attention while being owned by sovereign wealth funds, autocratic states, and billionaires who treat clubs as instruments of reputation management, are we still describing political consequence, or have we reached the point where the politics is the institution itself? And if we are inside that transition, what would it take for us to see it clearly rather than through the inherited vocabulary of sports and nations?
Talent leaves before loyalty follows. The behavioral signal now visible is not the reallocation of television subscriptions, but the systematic export of the youngest players whose careers will define national teams for decades to come. FIFA transfer records show international movements of players aged under 20 have more than doubled in the past 15 years, with the steepest increases recorded from West African and South American federations. Academies in those regions now operate as feeder systems for European clubs that scout and contract boys at 14 and 15 before they have played a senior match at home. The pattern is measurable in passport applications, visa categories, and the age profiles of academy squads across Portugal, Belgium, and the Netherlands. At the same time, domestic leagues in the same exporting countries register falling average attendance and shorter player careers. Senegal's top division, for instance, has seen its median player age drop, while the number of locally trained professionals reaching the national side before they turn 23 has declined. The revenue that once circulated inside national football economies now accrues to foreign entities that control the next contract and the next move. The political consequence is therefore not the capture of existing audiences, but the preemptive removal of the human material out of which future national institutions might have been built.
The essayist speaks of human material extracted and moved across continents. He is right, but the more profound shift is not in the geography of talent, but in the geography of the elements themselves. Water, soil, light. The raw materials of life are being reallocated by the game's new sovereigns. Consider Javier in the Axarquia region of Andalusia, east of Malaga. For 300 years, his family has grown olives on the dry hillsides. The water has always been negotiated, with the neighboring farms, with the village, with the seasons. It has been a human conversation. That conversation is now over. Down in the valley, where the river is lowest, are the new training grounds for a major European club. They are owned through a consortium of private equity vehicles registered in Luxembourg and Delaware, by men whose primary interest is not football, but the conversion of land into a balance sheet entry, and they have brought the hydraulic logic of global capital with them. The pitches are a miracle of engineering, impossibly green under the Spanish sun. They require more water per hectare than any farm in the valley, and the club can pay a price for it that makes a mockery of the price of olives. The local water authority, faced with a choice between 100 smallholders and one globally significant enterprise, makes the only choice a modern bureaucracy can. The political consequence is not found in a parliamentary vote. it is in the pressure of the pipes. This year, Javier's oldest trees are turning silver brown, their leaves curling in on themselves. He is not at a protest. He is not signing a petition. He is in his field, with a wrench in his hand, closing the valve on the well his grandfather dug. He is turning it slowly until it will turn no more.
The World Bank's 2018 Global Findex database records mobile money account penetration across 63 countries. In Kenya, it exceeds 70% of adults. In Tanzania, 45%. In Uganda, 50%. The technology that enabled this, M-Pesa and its variants, emerged from telecom infrastructure, not banking regulation. It bypassed the state's financial architecture entirely. Football is now doing something structurally identical, but in reverse. Where mobile money moved financial access out of state control and into private networks, football is moving civic obligation back into state balance sheets, but without the compensating tax base. The pattern appears wherever clubs have grown large enough to be systemically important to a city's international image, but remain privately held. When a club approaches insolvency, local governments discover they are the implicit guarantor of last resort. Not because statute requires it, but because the political cost of allowing visible failure exceeds the fiscal cost of a bailout. This is structurally similar to what happened when Portugal's government was compelled in 2008 to underwrite the debts of the Lisbon metro expansion, not because the law demanded it, but because a capital city's transport failure was politically unthinkable, except that the metro was publicly owned, and the football club is not. This creates a category error in how we account for political consequence. We measure football's effects on elections, identity, and soft power. We do not measure its effects on municipal credit ratings, pension fund exposure, and the opportunity cost of expenditures that would otherwise have funded libraries or transit systems. The clubs are not replacing the state as the geographer suggested. They are becoming embedded in its fiscal structure as informal but compulsory line items. The test case is not whether a tournament stops a war or a club holds a city together. It is whether a finance ministry in a country with one globally prominent club can allow that club to fail without triggering a political crisis that costs more than the rescue. The answer, increasingly, is no. Consider that when Valencia CF entered administration in 2023, the regional government of the Valencian community faced immediate legislative pressure to intervene, not from statute, but from the calculus that a club generating an estimated 800 million euros annually in regional economic activity had become, in practice, a public utility operating under private law. That is not political consequence dressed in sporting language. That is a fiscal obligation created by reputational dependency. The state is not withdrawing. It is being captured by institutions it does not own, but can no longer afford to lose.